Hey everybody, what's going on? It's Tim Malik here, bringing you some more chess analysis. Today, we're going to be talking about the Hungarian variation of the Sicilian Defense, and maybe some things you should look out for, as well as the general idea of the Sicilian Defense, and more specifically, the Hungarian variation. So, this is a game between myself and another chess.com user named Gabrielle_02. At the time this game was played, rated about 1300. It was actually played today, so thoughts are still fresh in my mind, and I think there's some interesting parts of this that you guys might enjoy. So, e4, c5. This is called the Sicilian Defense. This is probably the most highly played defense for black against e4, at least among Grandmaster players. Now, the oldest reply is, of course, e4, e5. But as time has gone on, a lot more people have started playing the Sicilian Defense, which is c5. And the reason for this is black looks to gain control over the d4 square by fianchettoing the dark squared bishop, for one. Black looks to develop his knights, and looks to get a safe king right away. Much like the King's Indian Defense in a way, but starting out with c5 is what leads into this. So the King's Indian Defense does this to a certain extent. The Perk Defense does this to a certain extent. Even the Slav Defense kind of does it. And of course the mouth slip Sicilian, the Karo-Khan, does this. But that's the general idea behind the Sicilian, is to control the d4 square, fight for your fair share of the center, and get a safe king. Obviously playing the black pieces puts you at an immediate disadvantage. Because white gets the initiative, they get to develop their pieces first. Typically, white's the first one to attack. With something like the Sicilian, it allows you to play very defensively, but be able to explode that defense at any given time in order to really crack down on an opponent's weakness. So, I will give a word of caution. If you are new at chess, the Sicilian is a great thing to learn. Maybe not a great thing to play right away. There are loads and loads and loads of variations of the Sicilian. If you don't know all the lines and your opponent does, you're gonna get crushed, right? I play the Sicilian and I end up losing with it more than I end up winning with it. That being said, I know that it's one of the best defenses against e4, and I'm still trying to get better at it. Thankfully, this game I won, and I think that by looking at these ideas, you can start to get an idea for yourself of whether this is a good idea for your play style. If this fits in for you, great. If not, watch some of the other videos on my channel. I'm sure you'll find an opening that's going to suit you a little bit better. So, my opponent responded, knight to f3, a good developing move, and he kind of contests this d4 square. He hasn't occupied it yet, but he wants to show that he's not going to give it up easily by playing knight f3. So I played g6 here, which brings us into the Hungarian variation of the Sicilian. The reason I'm playing g6 is, like I just explained, I want to bring my bishop here so that I can control this d4 square with the bishop and with the pawn, right? And then once I bring my knight to c6, I'm going to have 3 pieces on that square. That's going to keep me comfortable that I have my fair share of the center, and it's going to put my pieces in an area where they're not only going to be effective, but they're going to be defending my king. And I really, really, really don't want to get checkmated, so I am trying my hardest to do that by developing on the king's side, getting my pieces out quickly, and fighting for my fair share of the center. You aren't going to see me be overly aggressive until a little bit later in the game, and that's one of the things that's very important to recognize when you're playing black, is that you can't afford to be aggressive right away. Every trade you make as black is helping your opponent to develop a piece. You want to stop your opponent from developing as much as possible, and that's why this next move I was quite happy to see, actually, and it was d4. I know I said that I'm kind of fighting for d4, so you might think, wow, your opponent just occupied it. That's awful. Here's one of the core ideas that chess players function with. Sorry if I kind of butchered that, but we always want to capture towards the center of the board. In the beginning of the game, it's a great idea to grab control over the center, because the only minor pieces you can develop right off the bat are your knights, and they function best at the center. And the other idea is your opponent's king is at the center, and you want to checkmate your opponent's king. So grabbing control over the center of the board is really, really essential in any opening. So I fought for d4. I took the pawn, right? Not only have I captured towards the center with one of my pawns, so now I have 3 central pawns, and my opponent only has 1, as it stands right now. Not only have I done that, but I've managed to show that I am not going to be giving up that square. Next, I'm able to gain a tempo on my opponent's knight that just recaptured, and if he would have recaptured with the queen, it would be a similar story, by playing my knight to here. Again, if my opponent captures here with the knight, I'm able to trade my B pawn and put it where that C pawn was. So now I do have an isolated A pawn, sure, but I have all of my central pawns, and I'm ready to push them up the board, develop my pieces, and get that safe king. My opponent recognized that he doesn't want me to have all those central pawns, so he didn't take quite yet. Instead, he played bishop to e3. I think that my opponent had the right idea. I think white was playing correctly, so to speak. He needed to defend the knight, given it's already defended by the queen, so it didn't need to happen right away. But this isn't the way that I would have chosen to do this. If I were my opponent, if I were playing the white pieces, I probably would have played the knight out to here. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I believe that this is the dragon, that this would lead into the dragon variation of the Sicilian, with the way that I tend to play, with something like bishop to here, and then bishop here, hoping to develop the queen to d2 and then castle. But like I said, I'm not entirely sure if that's the dragon or not, but developing the knight here gives you a way to continue to develop pieces and not have to worry about kind of what squares your opponent's going to jump into while you aren't looking. You know, for example, by developing the bishop right off the bat, by going to bishop to e3, once I develop this bishop here, things start to look sketchy in the center of the board, because I can trade all of these pieces off and put his queen in the center and then gain a tempo on it. And that's obviously not something you want to allow your opponent to do, especially when you're playing the white pieces. You want to keep that initiative for as long as you possibly can. Also, worth mentioning, I didn't play it in this game, but I could have played queen to a5 check. This is a common theme that you'll see in the Sicilian Defense, that holding on to that queen to a5 check, because that can be incredibly helpful, especially if your opponent playing the white pieces starts to push down the board. If your opponent gets on that 5th rank, then playing queen to a5 check is a great way to not only stop the advance, but potentially win material. So, I didn't play that here. I decided to develop the bishop. Once again, taking control over that d4 square, showing that I want my fair share of the center while developing my pieces. My opponent played bishop to b5 here. I think that this isn't something that you typically want to be kind of going for when you're playing against the Sicilian. This is something you see a lot in, for example, the Spanish or the Roy Lopez, and it's a great way to kind of capture a pawn right off the bat during the opening to potentially be a pawn up. But whenever you're playing against a Sicilian defense, especially in the Hungarian variation, your opponent doesn't have any pawns that he's protecting with his knight. So while this was good in theory, maybe not so good in practice, if I would have developed a pawn to e5, and my knight was, you know, the sole defender of that pawn, then this would be a much better idea. However, since that's not the case, I don't really need to be worrying about it too much. So, I played knight to f6 here. I'm planning to castle. The knight on f6 attacks the undefended pawn on e4. If the pawn moves, it allows me to put my knight onto d5, which would threaten the dark square bishop right off the bat, and also threaten the undefended pawn. So if we look at, for example, the pawn pushing to here, I could take this pawn and be ahead material right away, or I could play a move like this, which not only threatens the pawn here, it threatens the bishop here. So it would lead into kind of a sharper game for me, and that's not something that we saw this game. So I developed a knight. My opponent played knight c3. So now, at least from what I can see, e5 is becoming a much more prominent threat. Because after moving the knight back to its natural square on f3, or maybe even capturing this knight, for example, if he captures here, first off, he can now play e5, and my knight no longer has this square to escape to. So that would be pretty dangerous. My knight also does not have this square to escape to. Or, well, it does have h5, but h5 isn't really a good square for a knight. And the only other option is to retreat to g8. So if that's my only option, you've potentially just won the exchange without really being up material. So that was one of my concerns. So we continued. I went ahead and castled here. If the pawn does drop at this point, I'm relatively comfortable because of my opponent's kind of bad developing in the beginning of the game, that playing a move like knight here is... What's going on? Okay. That playing a move like knight here is going to be beneficial to me because I'm going to have two attackers here and here, and be able to fight more heavily for that d4 square. Not to mention, I'm going to be able to capture that pawn. There's going to be too much firepower on there, on that square. So, while it is a concern, it's not a really, really big one. My opponent castled as well, and it was at this point that I decided that I should probably start looking to attack. My opponent lost the initiative. He decided to play very passive, play developing moves, and while all of those are great, if you don't take advantage of your opponent's weaknesses, and if you don't start to show me that you've got some sort of a plan, then players like me are going to try to take advantage of that, and we're going to try to force you into a situation that you're uncomfortable with. So I played a6, kind of questioning this bishop if it was really willing to take that knight, if he's really willing to make this exchange. And the answer was no. So I went ahead and took the knight. The reason behind this is after... Well, I'll show you in the game. After the bishop takes here, I have the move b5 to threaten the light square bishop again. And once it moves, I can develop my light square bishop, and now we're seeing that the threat on this pawn is becoming much more defined, and that black is showing a clear and evident threat, while white doesn't really have anything to show for that. You know, he's lost his kingside knight, he's retained the bishop pair, sure, but this diagonal, while okay, is not really being threatened by any of my pieces. I have no intention of putting my knight here. I have no intention of putting my bishop here. My concern is much more on this square, and the bishop kind of misses its mark, being where it is. So, my opponent played e5, thinking that he needs me to play in this bishop's diagonal and within this knight's rain of fire if he's going to have a chance of winning. And while that's true, I think e5 here was a little bit premature. I think that the bishop needed to be on a better square, and that maybe this knight could have found some solace on d5 a long time ago. So without those things, I don't think d5 was necessarily a good move. Again, the threat kind of being obvious, but if your opponent has squares to move his pieces to, and those squares help your opponent, you probably shouldn't threaten the piece and give him a reason to. So I decided to move here, and here's why. While I did just show this move, if I would have moved knight to d5, my opponent can capture with the knight. If I capture with the bishop, he captures with the bishop with the tempo on the rook. So I can still solve my problem of having that knight by playing knight to e4, because now I'm out of this bishop's diagonal. So when the knight captures and the bishop captures here, I can look to potentially develop my rook and threaten this square and win a pawn that way. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened in the game as well. So the knight took, I recaptured with the bishop, and so now I'm forming the plan of attacking on this square with moves like this, eventually maybe drawing this dark square bishop out and reclaiming this long diagonal for my bishop, and looking to form a solid attack on the queen's side, maybe even take advantage of these pawns, push them up, and get this light square bishop out of there as a defender. So my opponent played, again, a very obvious threat, just threatening the bishop, right? Again, if your opponent has a square that they can move their piece to that's better than the square that it's on, there's really no sense in threatening that piece and giving your opponent a reason to put his piece on a better square. Unless he really needed his rook on this file, which he's got pieces that aren't well developed, unless he really, really needed to make that move for his plan, I don't think he should have here. This just gave me an excuse to develop my knight back to f5, which is a better square, or I'm sorry, my bishop back to f5, which is a better square for my bishop. So I think that maybe that was a little bit of a mistake. I think that there were a lot better moves to make, but all things considered, my opponent is playing pretty well here so far. So he plays queen to f3 here, and this started to set up for something scary. Admittedly, I have played against kind of people that... I'm not even sure how to explain this. Basically, the idea here is that he is going to get his queen on this side of the board, try to get his rook onto this file here, and use this bishop pair and use these diagonals to be able to checkmate me on either h7 or h6. To do that, he's obviously going to need to push these pawns forward, but he has a lot of work in his way before any of that can happen. Over the next couple of moves, you're going to see me kind of frantically trying to stop this from happening, but ultimately I am able to succeed, and hopefully I'll be able to show you why and what to look out for when you're playing the Sicilian as far as this attack's concerned. So I played rook to c8. It's really important when you're playing the black pieces to continue to make threats. Anytime you're not making threats, your opponent is. So if you can get your opponent to respond to your threats and you aren't playing the other way around, you stand a much better chance of winning or even drawing, which can sometimes mean the difference between winning and losing a tournament. So really, really important to continue to make threats, and that's why I did this. Now I have the bishop staring here and the rook staring here, and he's only got one defender, which is that bishop. So, shaping up to be something good for me. This, I think, was the worst move my opponent made in this game. Not to say that my opponent has made a lot of bad moves. I just think that this was particularly bad, specifically because after the pawn takes here, the bishop can't recapture. This pretty much just gives up a pawn. I'm not sure what the entire thought process was. In fact, after playing the game, I know that my opponent plans to move his bishop here and start to try to cause some trouble on this d7 square, but he had such a good plan by having these long diagonals for his bishops and trying to get his rook over to like one of these squares and checkmate on h7 or h6 that I don't think it's necessary, after everything's said and done, to play his bishop here. I think it's just fine either where it is or trading off with my bishop to maybe get something for one of his rooks. This is where I think it started to fall apart for white. And let me know in the comments if you think that this is where it did as well. I think that there were a lot of mistakes made in the early game, but I think that this move in particular was kind of the hallmark of his losing the game. So I took with the pawn, of course. I had a hunch that the bishop was going to move afterwards and not recapture that pawn because he doesn't want to lose a bishop, and it did. So the bishop moved there, and I don't really see that as a threat. I've got my light square bishop on that square. I've got my queen on that square. And even once he gets the pawn here, if the pawn captures, bishop captures, queen captures, not too concerned about it. It just kind of loses an exchange, which it did. So I played queen to a5 here. And again, as I mentioned, this is something you see in a lot of variations in the Sicilian. It's important to kind of save this move until you need to play it. If I would have played this earlier, the board would look much different. My opponent would have a lot of pieces developed queenside, and we would see more action happening over there. The reason I've saved this move until now is my opponent has developed pieces on the king side and only one developed piece on the queen side. Since I was able to make things work like that, now my queen has a threat here. Even though it is defended, I understand. My queen has a threat here. My queen has a threat here. And once my pawn moves forward, my queen is going to be defending that pawn. All of those things considered, queen to a5 now is especially strong. Now, we also see that there's a bit of a conundrum here for my opponent. If he plays his pawn out here, then I'm going to start to push my pawn towards the end of the board and promote, which isn't really going to be too good. So it kind of puts my opponent in a bind of how to deal with this bishop, and I think ultimately my opponent chose the wrong move. So he played pawn here. If you're wondering why maybe I didn't just take this pawn, after this pawn recaptures, this bishop can just capture here, and since my queen is being threatened, I can't do anything about this rook kind of being attacked, so I would drop a rook ultimately in that exchange. That's why I didn't take this pawn. And also, if I would to do nothing about it, then he would just capture here, and that kind of undermines everything I was hoping to do. So that's why I played the pawn forward. We see the rook to c1, and now I've got a very, very clear plan and a really clear threat. I'm going to move my pawn up here. I'm going to capture this rook. The rook is going to have to come back to capture. My pawn is going to promote on c1, and then if his rook takes, I'll capture on c1 for checkmate. Checkmate in 2 after the queen drops back to d1. So now that all of these threats are very clear, my opponent is forced to play the way that I want him to. Over these next couple moves, try to keep a track of how many of these moves were absolutely forced and how many of them could have been avoided, because a lot of this is very, very forcing play. And this is what I was talking about when I mentioned how important the lines were in the Sicilian. There's some systems, the Sicilian's not one of them, but like the King's Indian Defense, where the moves are very transpositional. You know, it doesn't necessarily matter if you play knight f6 first or in the fourth move, or if you fianchetto the bishop by move 3 or not. It doesn't matter so much in systems like that. In the Stonewall Defense, in the Hedgehog, all of that is a more, I don't want to say relaxed style of playing, but for lack of a better term, that's what it is. The Sicilian is very, very sharp. If you don't continue to develop your pieces, make threats, and stay on top of things, your opponent is going to be able to crush you very easily, because simply playing c5 does not ensure you to have solid play as black. There's a lot of reasoning behind it, and there's a lot of thinking like this that needs to be done in order to ensure that you're going to have a good game. For example, in, this situation, I'm planning a queen sacrifice with, pawn here, and we'll just pick a move for white here. And this isn't a good move. I'm just kind of making a point. If he moves queen here, then I'm taking here for check. My opponent is playing the only legal move and recapturing with the rook. I'm playing here and promoting to a queen. And now it's going to be checkmate in just a few moves. If my opponent takes, it's checkmate in 1 here. If my opponent doesn't take, and, for example, tries to play queen here, queen takes, rook here, checkmate. So either way, it ends up working out really, really well for black. I think my opponent played the best moves possible, which isn't saying a whole lot considering how horrendous the position looks by now, but I do believe that my opponent has played the absolute best moves towards the end of the game. So after pawn here, my pawns move forward. Now my opponent has to act. He plays rook to c1, and I've closed the distance. So now my opponent has a decision to make. I'm sorry, that's not what was played. That's the variation. My opponent played rook e3, which is a very solid move. He saw the potential for this queen sacrifice and decided to avoid it by simply taking his rook out of that threat. So I played the queen to here, thinking, okay, well, I can take this bishop for free because it's undefended. My bishop defends my pawn, and this rook defends this pawn quite well. You've just taken one potential attacker off of this piece, so I don't need to worry about that so much anymore. So now I can start to form other threats, and while my original plan might not work, I might gain material out of it anyway. My opponent played bishop to c3, and here just a little bit of tactical maneuvering. So I didn't want to put my queen back where it was, obviously, because it would be captured by the bishop. I didn't necessarily want to play queen here, because it doesn't threaten a whole lot of anything. Queen back here gets taken by the pawn. Taking here does open things up for my rook, and maybe my pawn can promote, but it's all very risky, so I decided to go with a safer alternative and play queen here. You've taken your rook off of your back rank, which leaves this rook completely open to attack. If bishop here, then I capture on that square for free. I also threaten this pawn here, and there's not really a whole lot my opponent can do to stop it. So start to see some frantic moves from our opponent. He decides, hey, if that pawn's going to promote, I'd rather just capture it with my rook. So I happily accept that piece. My opponent decides to take the free pawn. I take the free bishop. Here we can see that things are desperate for white at this point. There's not a whole lot that white can do to sustain his chances. Moving the king over is a great idea because it allows for the rook to drop back and have at least one defender. So I played queen check. After rook here, I decided to put him in check again with the bishop, knowing that you can either take with the queen, block with the queen, or move the king. So if we look at each of those options, if you take with the queen, and I think that this is what was played, I take with the rook, you take with the rook, I win the bishop. If we go back and you block with the queen, I take here, and it's still check, so maybe king captures here, and then queen here check, the king is forced to move back here. And then maybe things start to look bleak in, that sense anyway. So we just won a queen pretty much. And if you move the king, I have checkmate in one. So those were the three options, and all of them kind of won for black. So that's not what was played. Come on. Okay, sorry about this, guys. My opponent took with the queen, which was maybe the best option. So I captured with the rook. He captured with the rook. I captured the bishop. It's now that my opponent needs to think very carefully about his next few moves. Obviously, he's down, a rook and a bishop in exchange. This is a resignable position, assuming your opponent doesn't screw up. But it's never a bad idea to play a game out anyway. Sometimes playing losing positions can really help you to get a better idea of what you should be doing when you're winning. Because sometimes the hardest thing to do in chess is win a winning position. So it's probably good that my opponent decided to continue playing this out. He pushed the pawn forward, I think just to stop this from being taken by the bishop, which I guess is a fine move. I maybe would have played the rook forward instead and tried to protect the pawn that way while maybe making some threats of my own, but I suppose either way works. I doubled up the rooks, thinking, hey, I can put you in check here, you capture with the rook, and then I can simplify the position a little bit more, gobble up the pawns, promote this guy, and everything will be good. My opponent saw the threat and decided to respond to it, so put him in check. He moved the king, I took the pawn, he pushed a pawn forward. I'm just going through this pretty quickly because all of this is pretty standard thinking. There's not a whole lot of tactical ideas going on or anything like that. It's just some endgame play. He decided to push another pawn again, I think my opponent's plan is just to try to push these pawns as forward as possible, use the king to try to make some threats, potentially win a bishop, and then be able to trade out his rooks and hope that I can't checkmate him with a rook and a king. So I played the rook down. The reason for this is I want to pin this pawn to the king and also be able to threaten this pawn. So I knew that my opponent would probably want to play rook here, and then I could play rook here and hopefully get a trade. So he played there, I played here. He moved the king, which was a really, really solid plan. Probably the best move available at the time. I captured anyway. He put me in check. This is one of the things I love about fianchettoing the dark square bishop and putting your king behind it. You never have to worry about a back rank mate because you always have bishop to f8, which is really helpful, especially in this position. So I played it. My opponent started pushing pawns again. I put my opponent in check. Check again, just trying to force him into the side of the board and get an exchange. So if we rewind here, there was a very specific thought, being that these squares are all controlled by my pawns. So once the king moved down, I know that the king can't move here, so if I put my opponent in check, I know the king is either forced to move to this square or this square. Knowing that, I can put a rook here and force him to trade me. And when you're ahead material like this, anytime you can force a trade, take it, because it's going to benefit you. Now, obviously, don't take it if it puts you in a terrible position and you're going to get checkmated. You guys are smart enough to know that, but that was the idea. So put him in check and then forced the trade. And my opponent went for a stalemate, which I thought was pretty smart. As I continued to gobble up pawns, he put his king in a position where if I bring my rook onto that d file, then he has no legal squares to move to, which I thought was pretty smart. So, you know, he obviously can't take here, here, or here, and if for whatever reason my rook were to come to this file after this pawn were out of the picture, it would be a draw by stalemate. So I had to be very careful of that. So I took there. I let my opponent kind of retain the ability to move around there and instead decided to just push the pawn, eventually promoting to a queen, and just being very careful not to let things end in a stalemate. The reason for the king move here is because now my opponent can't kind of seek solace at either one of these squares because my king controls them, so he's got to remain on this file or move to the side of the board I want him to move to. So that's the reason for the king move. So he decided to stay on the file. I just kind of gently pushed him away. It took a little while to kind of find the right moves to put him in checkmate, but it just kind of pushed him up the side of the board and kept taking space without putting him in stalemate, and eventually got checkmate on b1. I hope this was beneficial for you guys. I hope you learned a lot about the Sicilian, and if you were thinking about adding it to your repertoire, I would really highly recommend looking into a lot of the different variations and being very, very familiar with it before you try to play against some higher rated opponents. Again, just to be perfectly clear, this is not an easy way to play the game. I'm not particularly skilled. It was by luck that I ended up with an opponent that played badly against it, but hopefully you were able to see some of the benefits to it, and maybe some of the downsides as well. So thank you all so much for watching. My name's Timalik, and I hope to see you all next time. See you guys.